Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our habit of the conversation today. So this month, I am just so excited to spend a little time with Art and Bena talking about gathering data with all senses. Welcome, Bena. Welcome, Art.
Welcome, Allison. Good to be here.
So, as we start to think about gathering data with all senses, this is something that I know, Art, is a special favorite of yours. So, when we're starting to spend a little bit of time on gathering data with all senses, one of the areas that we want to pay attention to is that the 16 habits of mind are something that we really spend a significant amount of time, energy, and thoughtfulness in thinking about how it's impacting learning experiences, whether it's for young children or professional development or parenting conversations. And we've been picking several habits that actually are a little bit complex to start integrating into applications. So, gathering data with all senses, Bena, let's start with thinking about why this might be a little bit difficult to tie in. What are some of the potential misunderstandings, and what are some of the ways to make it so that it's more doable and possible?
Well, it's always interesting to me because one of the things that always surprises me is people say, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to make this particular habit work with the kids. And I always find that kind of surprising because so much of what we do is really about gathering data with all the senses. But I realize sometimes when I question and try to understand it better, that one thing that they sometimes have as an image about it is data. And they think data means, okay, is it something statistical we're supposed to see? Is it numbers we're supposed to be looking for? Are there measures we're supposed to be looking at? So I think it's really interesting that we sort of hold, when we say data, we hold on to that sort of information, when in fact, we're looking for patterns. We're looking for things that occur out in the world. In fact, Art, talk a little bit about what the kinds of things are that are out in the world that we could be collecting, because we have that capacity to not just find numerical values, but we have our senses.
And Art, before you get started, I just want to say that we are welcoming people from around the world, whether you're spending time with us on LinkedIn Live or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Please go ahead and offer a question or a comment to continue to contribute to the conversation. So, Art,
Talk to us about the senses.
Talk about the senses.
Well, of course, our bodies are open to receiving data all the time. We are receptive to all the sights and the sounds and the smells that are around us. And you can't go outside or take a walk or eat a dinner or be with your family without using your senses. And so it's a constant process that we are in. I think what we mean by the habits of mind, though, is becoming more aware of them and using them constructively. For one example, as we think about working with family or other people, we're alert to their facial expressions, their body language, the intonation of their voice. Sometimes people speak very rapidly, sometimes they speak very low and softly. And we hear those and we make different interpretations as we are hearing them. And so our bodies are such that we are gathering data through those senses all the time. And we use them wisely and we use them deliberately to enhance those senses and to enhance our understanding of others as well as our environment.
Art, I also thought that when we were all getting so used to Zooming all the time, always these digital ways and virtual ways of being, how many of our senses were lost because we couldn't actually have that tactile experience or have the opportunity to really read the cues of body language sometimes because we weren't really connecting in that way. So I think what you're saying is so powerful because there's so much data that we collect that we are possibly, when people were not able to hug, to be together, to be in groups together, what we missed so desperately were some of those sensory experiences.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
and by the way, Kim Felton is joining us saying, I also think data is everywhere. And then she said, this is awesome. So I think already, Kim, thank you so much for your contribution. The opportunity to start beginning to imagine that there is a ton of data. And Art and Bena, you just started to talk about the importance of body language, the notion of voice and intonation are just small moments of collecting and gathering data, starting to experience that. Art, can you talk a little bit more about the type of gathering as we're
Yes.
starting to think about the categories?
Well, yes. There really are three categories that we include. One we call reception, and that's being open and receptive to all those outside sources of information that you decide. And then there's also proprioception and interoception. And we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But let's start off with just a little bit of a review because you already know what reception is. And that's being open to the smells and the touch and the feelings and the shapes and the sounds that we hear around us. I like to take an imaginary trip, if you will, of cooking some popcorn. And when we cook popcorn, popcorn is probably the only food, and I would challenge you to find some others, the only food that we can use all of our senses. For example, you can feel that kernel of corn, say it's hard and golden, and then we put it in some hot oil, and we pop it so we can hear it, and then we can see it and feel it. And it's interesting that you can see and feel the change from that hard round kernel to a soft, crunchy piece of popcorn. And we can smell it as it's cooking. We can hear it. When we put it in our mouth, we can taste it. Can you taste that salty flavor? And so popcorn is the one food, there may be others, the one food that we can use to gather all of the senses. Now, why that's important is that you might want to use that with kids to teach them to be more alert to the smells and the sights and the sounds and the feel around them. So we feel things that are soft and things that are hard. We hear things that are soft and things that are loud. We see things that change their shapes. And so being open to all of those receptors, I think, is very important. Some kids, I hope you don't have any of these kind of kids, but they say, who cares? That's dumb. Well, it's not dumb. What we're saying is that those are the receptors through which we gather information throughout our lifetimes. And the more sensitive we are to them, the more positive we can be because we gather more data and we're alert to that. And what you said earlier, Allison, being alert to other people, to their smiles and their head nods and their body language and the intonation of their voice is all part of the living that we do throughout our lives. But let me tell you about two other sensory receptors that we don't often talk about. In fact, we have not included it in our description of data gathering, but we will from now on. And one of those is the notion of proprioception. Now, I want you to do an experiment with me. Would you please do as I say? With your hand, close your eyes and touch your nose. Now, how did you know where to put your hand and where to put your nose with your eyes closed? That's proprioception. In other words, your musculature is telling you where to put your hand, and that's what we mean by proprioception. It's our brain's ability to receive signals from our fingers, hands, arms, and face. And so we use proprioception when we can't use our eyes. For example, have you ever seen an accordion player or a guitar player or a piano player who looks at the camera but doesn't look at the keys on the keyboard, or doesn't look at the strings on the violin or the strings on a guitar. They are using proprioception because they can know where the strings are or where the keys are without having to look at them. And so we use proprioception all the time when we are aware of something, but we don't have to actually touch it or feel it to be aware of it.
So, Art, I just want to interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
And Bena, I just wanted to sort of think through with you when it comes to proprioception, like the opportunity to start thinking about practice and training in connection with gathering data through all senses. Can you talk a little bit about that, Bena, in terms of how you start to see, like, I'm just trying to think about the notion of muscle memory, for example.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
yeah. So, Bena, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, the person who we're going to be interviewing in our next session is going to talk a great deal about that, but he's my trainer. And one of the things that I said to him was, he always says, chin up, keep yourself looking forward. And I say, but if I don't look down, how am I going to know if something comes up, if there's a bump in the road? And he said, your feet will tell you. You have to train your feet to feel the ground. So that's a very interesting thing, because it's really takes a lot of thinking about it. Now, when you're young, that is something that I think young people sort of do without even thinking about it, because they're grounded, so to speak. And I think that it's that idea again of that muscle memory. You know, you're being able to remember and you're being able to imagine it.
Yes, it's the ability to see yourself and feel yourself in space. As a teacher, you do a lot of things that help kids orient themselves in space. For example, when you say, turn your paper over and put your name and the date in the upper right-hand corner of the page. Now, listen to all that. Turn your paper over, put your name in the upper right-hand corner. You have to orient yourself into space. So when you use directions like put it on top of, put it next to, put it surrounding, make it go around, put it beside, or you stand in line and say, Billy, stand in front of Mary and behind Johnny. Notice how you have to orient yourself then to two other people. So you can really help kids do that when you pay attention to the directions that you give. And so giving directions in space is what orients themselves as to where their bodies are.
So Michelle DeBellis, and wonderful to hang out with you, Michelle, long distance. She's talking about the idea that this conversation is really thinking about training your feet to feel the ground. And she says, loves this, reminds me of dancing. So
right.
So the opportunity to really start to see the messages that we're receiving constantly based on where our body is in space and potentially time. So the notion of dancing, that there is a rhythm that's associated with it that actually continues to influence what we think in our head and what our actions are taking. So
any kind of a physical sport, as you mentioned, dancing, martial arts, Tai Chi, playing games, playing football, for example, are all exercises in managing your body in space.
Absolutely. And I know that the early positional words like up, down, left, right, beneath,
Exactly.
all of those words are incredibly important to continue to build physical awareness. It's also geographic awareness. So the opportunity to start thinking about directions, similar to what Art was suggesting, not just turning the page over, but starting to navigate the neighborhood. So those are, again, some really helpful, some concrete examples. Let's talk about the next shun, Art. What's the next territory?
All right. The next data source that we have is from our own bodies. And it's different than proprioception. We call it interoception. Now, intero, it means interior. So it's the feelings that you get from your own interior muscles and body parts. For example, do any of you ever feel hungry? Sure you do. That's your tummy talking to you. Do you ever find yourself breathing deeply? Why do you do that? Because your body tells you that you need to take a breath. It's very important that kids learn those parts of the bodies and to respect them. And so we feel our toes, and you can have kids stop and say, all right, just sit there for a moment and wiggle your toes. Do you feel them? How about move your ankles? How about lift your feet? How about your elbow and your arms? And so we can get kids to become sensitive to the parts of their body and how they feel, so the kids can read that and know what their body is telling them. It's very interesting that we have a nerve that goes from our head down our back, and the body connects all of those, and that sends feelings from your toes to your brain. That's what connects the senses to your brain, and we read those senses in our brain, but our toes and our hands and our teeth and our mouth are all sending us signals through that nerve to our brain. So we learn to become very sensitive to those. You can have your kids, for example, do a body scan while they're just sitting down, mentally scanning your body from head to your toe, paying attention to any bodily sensation that comes across you. Does your muscles hurt after a game? Do you find yourself breathing deeply after you've been playing baseball or football? Do you jerk up when you are scared of something? That's your body talking to you, and those are interoceptions of how your body is telling how your body parts are telling your body what to do and how to feel. So we're with those all the time.
Here's a beautiful example that I observed of an art teacher in a school in New York City, where she was bringing kids who were coming, as they do, from second grade, hither and yon, all over the place, coming in for art. And so she wanted to calm them down. So what did she do? The first thing she did was she put some music on. She had this nice calming music, but then she stopped the music and she said, okay. And she said, let's tap. And they tapped their body. Tap, tap, tap where your heart is, tap where your shoulders are. They tapped. And all of that tapping was feeling themselves, feeling their muscles, interoception, calming themselves down, breathing. And then she said, now I'm going to give you the materials to work with. And they got crayons and they got paper, and she had them doing a project. I have never seen an art class as engaged and quieted as that little activity that she did to just get them to be there. That was taking their senses. And then, fortunately, as an art teacher, she could get them to express them with color, with the ways that they were going to do their work. What a beautiful experience to say, we are gathering data with all of our senses to be in this art room together today. Lovely.
And I want to bring in some other conversational points that are coming in the comments. So if you want to join the conversation, please go ahead and respond. We definitely get those messages, and it continues to not only sort of push our thinking, but we can sort of interact and respond to some of the questions. So Dina Dormer, it's wonderful to see you. She's saying this is an awesome habit to explicitly employ in science classes. So students tend to default only what they can see at first when making observations, and do fantastically with this habit when asked to expand to all senses as appropriate. And Art, I know you and I are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the connection to science content in a few minutes, but I want to actually move to a question that Carol Hill, and wonderful to see you, Carol. Carol Hill is actually raising for a topic point. I love to hear you talk about the physical nature of gathering data through all the senses and connections you make between that and social emotional learning and intelligence.
Good.
So can we sort of spend a little bit of time on that particular point? So Art, you want to go first?
No, I want to hear Carol's first.
We can't hear her.
That's right. So Carol really is posing that as a topic for us to sort of think about. And Carol, if you want to continue to add a little bit of the thinking on your mind through the comments, and we'll post that up on the screen. But Bena, why don't you start to spend a little bit of time generating our initial thoughts on that topic?
Well, I think that I began by actually describing what this teacher did, because what she was doing was fundamentally, she was getting the children to be aware of their experience. And that is a social and emotional experience. So you're in the space with other people. That's your proprioception. So you're in a space with other people and you're finding that space. And then you're also breathing, you're calming yourself down, you're breathing. All of that is about finding your way to be then thinking interdependently, or finding your way then to be able to really work with other people in the room in that space. So I think that it has a lot to do, the gathering data with all senses has a lot to do with your social and emotional development. And
Yes.
you're attuned to that. So that would be a start on the subject.
Very much so. The first attribute of an emotionally intelligent person is awareness. And that means awareness in yourself. What are the feelings that I'm having? Where are they coming from? And what are the feelings that other people are having? So you gather data by looking at, by studying, by listening to, by hearing other people. And that gives you a lot of information. For example, if you see a person frowning or a person smiling, we make an interpretation of that as either being depressed or being elated by humor or something. And so we see the facial expressions and the body language, and we make an interpretation. We hear their voices. And when they talk very rapidly, you think, oh my goodness. And you think, all right, he's very stressful. And so we are always interpreting what we are seeing and hearing other people do. And from that, we make inferences as to their emotions.
So Art, Dina Dormer is sort of attuned with you right now. So she, in the chat a few moments ago, wrote self-awareness and self-management as the connective threads. And again, that's honoring what you're saying now, Art. You know, one of the other interesting parts of this, that Art, Ben, and I went down a rabbit hole about a year ago in conversation around the idea of emotions and the importance of language. And so the thinking is that sometimes what we see in terms of gathering data, when you start to see a frown or a smile or a speedy voice or a slow voice, may or may not line up with the experience that that other individual is feeling. So another interesting dynamic is thinking about the habit of mind or two that go along with gathering data with all senses, because oftentimes we want to make sure that we're not misappropriating what we are starting to observe based on how we frame the world as opposed to how somebody else is framing the world.
That's
so
right.
Bena, what habit do you think is also helpful to bring in as part of this conversation in addition to gathering data?
Well, I mean, I always think that you always want to be checking your assumptions. You always want to be saying, I may be making this inference, but is it right? Mm-hmm. So I would certainly attune through listening with understanding and empathy. I would attune with questioning and posing problems. I would attune, I think, with thinking flexibly, meaning it's not just about what I think I'm seeing, but there may be other alternatives. So to me, they all sort of weave together. because I think that you're gathering data doesn't mean that you're accurately gathering data until you check and see where you are with it,
Absolutely.
which is why it's so important to scientists, because you're hypothesizing when you're gathering data. You're not necessarily gathering it as informational, although sometimes you are.
And so Michelle is adding to the conversation saying, Allison, you reminded us of the importance of listening and checking understanding through paraphrasing. And again, I think this is so incredibly important because Michelle, earlier on in the conversation, you added a comment around gathering data through all senses in relation to dialogue. So when we are engaging in conversation with others and when conflict emerges, how might we use this habit of mind to navigate that conflict well? So, Art, Bena, what are your thoughts on that in particular, in addition to pairing it with listening with understanding and empathy?
It's looking for consistency, consistency of voice, body language, intonation, and so on. Let me give you an example. Have you ever seen a growling dog who's wagging his tail at the same time? That's inconsistent. And so we find that in other people too. A person can smile and at the same time do a very dastardly deed. That's an inconsistency. So we look for those consistencies. If you're smiling and laughing and your voice is giggling, that's consistent. But if you're smiling and laughing and you're doing a dastardly deed, that's inconsistent. So we're looking for the relationship between what you're doing and what's going on in your face and your body to show that consistency. And humans are very, very sensitive to the inconsistencies. We've just come off of well, I don't want to get political, but we've just come off of the trials of Donald Trump. And throughout that entire, what was it, 15, 18 days of trial, they were looking for consistencies and inconsistencies between what was being said, how it was being said, voice intonation, and the jury and the judge and Donald himself were picking up cues all the time about the consistency with what people were saying. And they detect error, they detect lies, they detect truths through the consistency between what people say and the data that they have and how the person is saying it.
But however, I don't think we always are consistent. For example,
No.
I know that there are times when people are nodding, like they're really agreeing with you, but actually they're making a shopping list for where they're going to go when afterwards and how don't forget to get this or that. In other words, you can mask how you're feeling also so that you can look like you're very attuned when in fact your mind is going somewhere else. It's that discipline of being able to stay with things and actually lend your mental activity to it. That's not that easy. And I think that that's another aspect of what we're exploring. It doesn't always show up.
So we have a conversation that's popping up now from Fata. So are there any limitations to the accuracy or reliability of data gathered through certain senses? So she's looking to start to think about, are there some examples, for example, of how gathering data has been applied in different fields and industries? So as we start to think about this, I know we started to touch on a court trial, but it's starting to think about other domains outside of politics of where you can start thinking about gathering data through all senses and how that actually continues to not only be applied in contemporary fields and industries, but also dealing with the potential misunderstanding or inaccuracy.
I'll give you some examples. We hear an awful lot these days about what is good leadership. And staffs have been known to write tomes on how they interpret their leaders' behavior. And let me give you just a few examples. We heard this from one of the authors recently. Are you consistent with what you, if there are consistency between what you say and how you act? It's called integrity. And the human's ability to detect incompatibilities between what one professes and how one acts. So I say one thing, but I act in a different way. We're very keen on picking those up, and so it's very important that we walk our talk, that we behave in the manner that what we profess is also how we act.
Yeah.
People are very much alert to that. So that's one.
Yeah, Art, I think the other part too that I want to bring in is the idea of multitasking. And sometimes, again, I was thinking about Bena's shopping list, the idea of when we are trying to switch to engage in a series of tasks all at once, the opportunity is that when I am being like sort of read by somebody else in terms of body language or a facial expression, it may or may not be accurate depending on where my mind is in that particular moment as well. So I think another opportunity of trying to think about the limitations when you are more inclined to be present, the more I mean, I'm thinking that it's not just integrity, Art, but it's also the more apt people are to see your thinking or your mind as it is happening in your mind. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, and that's a cue for us as teachers as well, because, for example, teachers who are inquirers get more responses from kids than teachers who are lecturers. Now, that doesn't mean that we never give a lecture, but it does mean that as we are lecturing, we might also stop every once in a while and ask some questions. We might call on students. And so we know that the brain turns off after a period of time. And after about 20 minutes of lecturing is about all we can take before there needs to be some kind of engagement. And teachers do that very well. So we know that the mind begins to wander when it's bored or when it's turned off or disinterested. So that tells us something as teachers, that we have to keep kids engaged. We have to keep kids active, kids using their hands and moving, for example, is very important for them. And so we do that as good teachers, I think.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm noticing a comment from Kim Felton again. So thanks, Kim, for spending time with us this evening. She's suggesting the idea of being intentionally present. And I'm reminded, Bena, of the art example, but can you share another example? I know we chatted about this the other day in New York City about the notion of breaks in the hall. So can you tell us, paint a picture for us in terms of that example that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty amazing. What they did was, it's just a regular old building, but what they did was the kids have to go from one end of the building to another to go to different situations. And so they found that it was very hard for the kids to kind of, they wanted to release when they went out of the room. So what they did was they painted on they got these stickers, I guess, that they created on the floors. And so one would say squat now, and another would say hop, and another would say jump. And so the kids would walk almost as if you were playing a little game, and they would all go in line and they would all do these activities all the way through down the hallway. I mean, it was just amazing. Another thing in this school that I thought was pretty amazing was that they had something called a calming room. And in the calming room, it was all sensory. So it was like a Reggio room. It was all like, this is a place where you can sort of just touch something. This is where the odor is now going to get you. This is where you can see something, lights and things. And again, it's just like it settles you in. Yeah. And kids found that they were able to go into this room. It was a special ed room in the beginning, and then it just became a room. And you know what? Teachers find it quite calming as well.
So I think the intention of proprioception is happening as Bena started to describe that. And even as Bena was talking about the work that she's done with her trainer, who we're so excited is going to join us in our next interview, when Bena started talking about chin up, the idea is that I had this mindset of like shoulders back, you know what I mean? Feet on the floor. So the idea of like trying to start to think about when Bena started changing the way that her body was posturing, it actually triggered me to do the same. So when you started to describe the tapping and the calming room, it's not just the settling that Bena is describing, but in fact, as she's describing it, it does have a settling effect. So I think that's the opportunity, Kim, as I started to circle back on being intentionally present, it actually does have that quality and that reverberation as part of the experience, even if somebody is just telling an example or two. So Art, I want to turn to you now, and we're going to talk a little bit about connections to subject area content. So Art, do you want to start with one or two examples of that?
Oh, I would start with the example in science. Scientists have to be very aware of their senses. They pick up data from all over and continuously. I'm intrigued and entranced with what we're doing with the James Webb Telescope. The gathering of data from our space is absolutely enthralling and amazing. Answering the questions that we've asked for years. What's the universe composed of? Are there other planets? Is there life on Earth? Why do we have differences in gravity in one space and a different gravity in another? How does the sun exert gravity on to maintain planets around it? Are there any other planets flying around? In other words, a whole series of questions come up that intrigues the scientists through those senses. They have to gather the data through the senses and then see their consistency. And with their mathematical formulas, they realize that, hey, you know that the universe is not expanding at a regular rate. There are different parts of the universe that are expanding and contracting at different rates. How we never thought of that? Einstein never gave us that information. How are we measuring it? And all that gathering of data leads to more questions, which leads to more research, which leads to our knowledge. And so that's been going on for centuries. And we can't have science without that. It's absolutely essential.
Absolutely. And again, the inspiration from the James Webb Telescope is significant, and it's absolutely awe-inspiring, not just to budding scientists in high school classrooms, but also to everyone around the world.
Oh, yes.
But let's turn to an early childhood example.
For
So
sure.
the idea of what 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds can do. So this is an example that is coming from a school in Northern Virginia, and starting to think about how do we begin to frame a curriculum narrative or storyline of the kind of sensory experience that 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are going to experience. So Bena, as you start to think about the interaction with this curriculum storyboard, I don't know if you can make a sense of that opening statement, but can you just do me a solid and read that magic?
I hope I can read it all right. What do you want me to read? How do my senses help me explore what's in the natural world? So then I go and I'm the teacher and I say, kids, guess what we're going to be doing this year? We're going to be figuring out what's around me. And then we're going to see what's up, what's down, what's around me. Imagine that we're going to have this adventure together. And this adventure is going to tell us about things that I have a really big word. I'll bet you're going to want to know. It's called proprioception. All right. What's around me? We're going to figure it out.
And the fabulous part about this example, and Michelle was the brainchild behind this in her early science curriculum design, where she actually started to think about in what ways not only can this be framing a story for the interaction between the teacher and the students, but also framing the story where families have a window into the classroom. So the idea is that she's describing, in terms of the authentic demonstration of learning, areas that parents and families can too be part of the conversation and part of the action. So in Unit 2 on What's Up, it's we will observe how our feathered friends adapt to keep themselves warm as the weather gets colder. And next, we're going to do a bark rubbing with crayons and include them in our nature journals. Lastly, we'll experience the winter sky and weather and record what we see. So the opportunity to continue to see that it's not just what we're doing as part of a classroom learning experience, but this actually is the binding agent as we continue to be responding with wonderment and awe about everything in the natural world, and attuning to the idea that this is something that we can actually connect and express that wonderment and awe with our families as well as in the classroom.
Such a beautiful storyboard. It really is. You know, it just makes you realize how exciting the world can be. And yet I'm teaching science. And I think it's that combination that is so beautifully done here.
I mean, I think, Art, as well, when you started talking about what was running from the top of the head down the base of the spine, and starting to think about that from an anatomy and physiology class, so we can begin to think about our little ones and our older ones as they're taking more of a top upper school level anatomy and physiology course, and beginning to start to see that I can explain, or I can give a sense of human behavior, not only in how I'm thinking and reacting using our shuns that we talked about, but the other opportunity is to continue to be metacognitive about what is happening and how not only am I responding, but how my responses are then transmitting information to other people.
Very much so. And you're hearing a lot about that information being transmitted, that is it truthful? So we need to get into the habit of saying, what data do you have to back it up? And we're hearing that more and more with artificial intelligence and politicians, but they're making claims that may or may not be true. So we all need to get into the habit of seeking data to support your beliefs and understandings.
So as we are winding down, so again, it's been such a lovely, rich conversation with the two of you. Bena, can you just give a little teaser about our special guest in our next interview?
Well, yeah, and I've been working with this person. He's a chiropractor and also does personal training. And he is a deep believer in the proprioception, interoception, but mainly because he says that you need to be able to just develop these. And he calls them, since I've been working with him for almost 20 years. And what he realized is that I've been doing habits of mind and he's doing habits of movement. And so his habits of movement, he's named 8 habits that are really important. And for any of you who are interested in it, he's going to be talking with us about that. And it's all about strength. It's all about balance. It's all about how all of this work of gathering data with all your senses is what keeps you able, as you're aging and as you're more aware of the need for this, to stay upright and stay balanced and helps you with your mental and your physical health.
And Bena, as you started to say that, I just stood more upright and balanced. You said that.
Yes.
That's right, Fata. That's a concrete example of different fields and industries. So we are going to start to branch out and engage other people in conversations outside of schools to continue to see how it's impacting their world. Art, the last word before we end our conversation for this evening.
Well, to the teachers then, help kids become aware of the data that surrounds them and the data that is within their body. So building awareness of the senses is absolutely important.
Well, again, it's been such a joy spending a little bit of time with Art Costa and Bena Kallick. And as we continue to peruse around the 16 habits of mind, that sometimes a phrase or the entire thing needs to be unpacked, go ahead and leave in the comments something that you would love to have us spend a little time connecting on. So Michelle DeBellis is saying, good for the mind, body, and heart, and excited for this future conversation with EJ. Catherine saying, thank you for the chat. Kim saying, thank you so much. And we are looking forward to our next conversation. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.